Hello everyone, Merry Imagination here. You may be wondering, where are you right now? Well, I'm here at my desk where I do all of my editing for Knots Network, Imagination Productions, and other things, and DK Brigade, and where I write. You can see Stephen King's tips on writings, you can see artwork. This one is by Ben Russell, and then some Eden Roche right there, and a ghost. Yes, a ghost poster right there, and some pops invading my workspace. Yeah, so this is where I do all of my work and creating and all that spooky good stuff. I'm here to read you a spooky story while we're in this coronavirus isolation. One of my favorite podcasts, the Reading Glasses podcast, are going to be doing a discussion on the story that I'm reading today on the 29th of this month. And that story happens to be my favorite Edgar Allan Poe story. And so we shall commence with a dramatic reading of The Masque of the Red Death. The Red Death had long devastated the country. No pestilence had ever been so fatal or so hideous. Blood was its avatar and its seal, the redness and horror of blood. There were sharp pains and sudden dizziness, and then profuse bleeding of the pores, with dissolution. The scarlet stains upon the body, and especially upon the face of the victim, were the pest ban which shut him out from the aid and from the sympathy of his fellow men. And the whole seizure, progress, and termination of the disease were the incidents of half an hour. But the Prince Prospero was happy and dauntless and sagacious. When his dominions were half depopulated, he summoned to his presence 1,000 hale and light-hearted friends from among the knights and dames of his court, and with these retired to the deep seclusion of one of his castellated abbeys. This was an extensive and magnificent structure, the creation of the prince's own eccentric yet august taste. A strong and lofty wall girdled in it. The wall had gates of iron. The courtiers, having entered, brought furnaces and massy hammers, and welded the bolts. They resolved to leave means neither of ingress or egress to the sudden impulses of despair or the frenzy from within. The abbey was amply provisioned. With such precautions, the courtiers might bid defiance to contagion. The external world could take care of itself. In the meantime, it was folly to grieve or to think. The prince had provided all the appliances of pleasure. There were buffoons, there were improvisatori, there were ballet dancers, there were musicians, there was beauty, and there was wine. Oh, you can't live without that the vino. Okay, back to the story. All these and security were within. Without was the Red Death. It was toward the close of the 5th or 6th month of his seclusion, and while the pestilence raged most furiously abroad, that the Prince Prospero entertained his 1,000 friends at a masked ball of the most unusual magnificence. It was a voluptuous scene, that masquerade. But first let me tell of the rooms in which it was held. There were 7. An imperial suite In many palaces, however, such suites form a long and straight vista, while the folding doors slide back nearly to the walls on either hand, so that the view of the whole extent is scarcely impeded. Here the case was very different, as might have been expected from the Duke's love of the bazaar. The apartments were so irregularly disposed that the vision embraced but little more than one at a time. There was a sharp turn at every 20 or 30 yards, and at each turn a novel effect. To the right and left, in the middle of each wall, a tall and narrow Gothic window looked upon a closed corridor which pursued the windings of the suite. These windows were of stained glass, whose color varied in accordance with the prevailing hue of the decorations of the chamber in which it opened. That at the eastern extremity was hung, for example, in blue, and vividly blue were its windows. The second chamber was purple in its ornaments and tapestries, and here the panes were purple. The third was green throughout, and so were the casements. The fourth was furnished lighted with orange. The fifth was white. The sixth was violet. The seventh apartment was closely shrouded in black velvet, tapestries that hung all over the ceiling and down the walls, falling in heavy folds upon the carpet of the same material and hue. But in this chamber, the color of the windows failed to correspond with the decorations. The panels here were scarlet, a deep blood color. Now, in no one of 7 apartments was there a lamp or candelabrum amid the profusion of gold ornaments that lay scattered to and fro, or depended from the roof. It took me a second. There was no light of any kind emanating from lamp or candle within the suite of the chambers, but in the corridors that followed the suite there stood opposite to each window a heavy tripod bearing a brazier of fire that protected its rays through the tinted glass and so glaringly illuminated the room, and thus produced a multitude of gaudy and fantastic appearances. But in the western or black chamber, the effect of the firelight was streamed upon the dark hangings through the blood-tinted panes, was ghastly in the extreme. Tim's messing with me now. Ah! And produced so wild a look upon the countenances of those who entered, that there were few of the company bold enough to set foot within the precincts at all. It was in this apartment also there stood against the western wall a gigantic clock of ebony. Its pendulum swung to and fro with a dull, heavy, monotonous clang. And when the minute hand made the circuit of the face, and the hour was to be stricken, there came from the brazen lungs of the clock a sound which was clear and loud and deep and exceedingly musical, but of so peculiar a note and emphasis that at each lapse of an hour the musicians of the orchestra were constrained to pause momentarily in their performances, to hearken to the sound, and thus The waltzers perforce ceased their evolutions, and there was a brief disconcert of the whole gay company. And while the chimes of the clock yet rang, it was observed that the giddiest grew pale, and the more aged and sedate passed their hands over their brows, as if in confused reverie or meditation. But when the echoes had fully ceased, a light laughter at once pervaded the assembly. The musicians looked at each other and smiled as if their own nervousness and folly, and made whispering vows to each other that the next chiming of the clock should produce in them no similar emotion. And then, after the lapse of 60 minutes, which embraced 3,600 seconds of the time that flies, there came yet another chiming of the clock, and then were the same disconcert and tremulousness and meditation as before. But in spite of these things, it was a gay and magnificent revel. The tastes of the Duke were peculiar. He had a fine eye for colors and effects. He disregarded the decora of mere fashion. His plans were bold and fiery, and his conceptions glowed with barbaric luster. Woo! There are some who would not have thought him mad. His followers felt that he was not. It was necessary to hear and to see and touch him to be sure that he was not. He had directed in great part the movable embellishments of the 7 chambers upon occasion of his greatest fete, and it was his own guiding taste which had given character to the masqueraders. Be sure they were grotesque. They were much glare and glitter and piquancy and phantasm, much of which has been said seen in Hernani. There were arboresque figures with unsuited limbs and appointments. There were delirious fancies, such as madman fashions. There was much of the beautiful, much of the wanton, much of the bizarre, something of the terrible, and not little of that which might have excited disgust. To and fro in the 7 chambers there stalked, in fact, a multitude of dreams, and these the dreams writhed in and about, taking hue from the rooms, and causing the wild music of the orchestra to seem as an echo of their steps. And anon, there strikes the ebony clock which stands in the hall of the velvet, and then for a moment all is still, and all is silent, save the voice of the clock. The dreams are still frozen as they stand, but the echoes of the chime die away. They have endured an instant, and a light, half-subdued laughter floats after them as they depart. And now again the music swells, and the dreams live and writhe to and fro more merrily than ever before, taking hue from the many tinted windows through which stream the rays from the tripod. But to the chamber lies most westwardly to the 7, there are now none of the masqueraders who venture, for the night is waning away, and there flows a ruddier light through the blood-colored panes, and the blackness of the sable draperies appalls. And to him whose foot falls upon the sable carpet, there comes from near clock of ebony, a muffled peal more solemnly empathetic than any which reaches their ears who indulge in the most remote gaieties of the other apartments. But these other apartments were densely crowded, and in them beat feverishly the heart of life. And the revel went whirling on until at length there commenced the sounding of midnight upon the clock. And then the music ceased, as I have told, and the evolutions of the waltzers were quieted. There was an uneasy sensation of all things as before, but now there were 12 strokes to be sounded by the bells of the clock, and thus it happened. Perhaps the more of thought crept with more time into the meditations of the thoughtful among those who revelled, and thus too it happened, perhaps, that before the last echoes of the last chime had utterly sunk into silence, there were many individuals in the crowd who had found leisure to become aware of the presence of a masked figure which had arrested the attention of no single individual before. And the rumor of this new presence having spread itself whisperingly around, there arose at length from the whole company a buzz or murmur expressive of disapprobation and surprise, then finally of terror, of horror, and disgust. Of disgust. In an assembly of phantasms such as I have painted, it may well be supposed that no ordinary appearance could have excited such a sensation. In truth, the masquerade license of the night was nearly unlimited, but the figure in question out-Heroded Herod, and gone beyond the bounds of even the prince's indefinite decorum. There are chords in the heart of the most reckless which cannot be touched without emotion. Even with the utterly lost, to whom life and death are equally jests, there are matters of which no jests can be made. The whole company indeed seemed now deeply to feel that in costume and bearing of the stranger neither wit nor propriety existed. The figure was tall, gaunt, and shrouded from head to foot in the habiliments of the grave. The mask which concealed the visage was made so nearly to resemble the countenance of a stiffened corpse that the closest scrutiny must have had difficulty detecting the cheat. And yet all of this might have been endured, if not improved, by the mad revelers around. But the mummer had gone so far as to assume the type of the Red Death. Ooh. His vesture was dabbed in blood. His broad brow, with all the features of the face, was besprinkled with the scarlet horror. When the eyes of Prince Prospero fell upon the spectral image, which, with a slow and solemn movement, as if more fully to sustain its role, stalked to and fro amongst the waltzers, he has seemed to be convulsed in the first movement with a strong shudder, either of terror or distaste, but in the next his brow reddened with rage. "Who dares?" he demanded hoarsely of the courtiers who stood near him. "Who dares insult us with this blasphemous mockery?" Seize him and unmask him, that we may know whom we have to hang at sunrise from the battlements. They're gonna hang him at the battlements? We'll see. It was in the eastern or blue chamber in which stood the Prince Prospero. As he uttered these words, they rang throughout the 7 rooms, loudly and clearly. For the prince was a bold and robust man, and the music had become hushed at the waving of his hand. It was in the blue room where stood the prince, with a group of pale courtiers by his side. At first, as he spoke, there was a slight rushing movement of this group in the direction of the intruder, who at the moment was also near at hand, and now with deliberate and stately step made closer approach to the speaker. But from a certain nameless awe, which the mad assumptions of the mummer had inspired the whole party, there were found none who put forth a hand to seize him, so that unimpeded he passed within a yard of the prince's person, and while the vast page-turn assembly, as if with one impulse, shrank from the centers of the room to the walls, he made his way uninterruptedly, but with the same solemn and measured step which had distinguished him from the first, through the blue chamber to the purple, through the purple to the green, through the green to the orange, through this again to the white, and even thence to the violet, and ere a decided movement had been made to arrest him. It was then, however, that the Prince Prospero, maddening with rage and the shame of his own momentary cowardice, rushed hurriedly through the 6 chambers, while none followed him on the account of a deadly terror that had seized upon all. He bore aloft a drawn dagger, and he had approached in rapid impetuosity to within 3 or 4 feet of the retreating figure, when the latter, having attained the extremity of the velvet apartment, turned suddenly and confronted his pursuer. There was a sharp cry, and the dagger dropped, gleaming upon the sable carpet, upon which instantly afterward fell prostrate in death the Prince Prospero. Then summoning the wild courage of despair, a throng of revelers at once threw themselves into the black apartment, and seizing the mummer, whose tall figure stood erect and motionless within the shadow of the ebony clock, gasped in unutterable horror at finding the grave cerements and corpse-like mask which they've handled so violently, a rudeness unattended by any tangible form, and now was acknowledged the presence of the Red Death. He had come like a thief in the night, and one by one dropped the revelers in the blood-bedewed halls of their revel, and died, each in their despairing posture of his fall, and the life of the ebony clock went out with that of the last of the gay, and the flames of the tripods expired, and darkness and decay and the Red Death held illimitable dominion over all. Wasn't that that amazing? Oh, that last line. That is the best line that Poe has written across his works. And darkness and decay and the Red Death held illimitable dominion over all. Ooh, it's so spooky. It's so scary. I love this story so much. It has, in fact, inspired a scene in another one of my favorite stories, The Phantom of the Opera by Gaston Leroux, where Eric the Phantom dresses as the Red Death, and he says different things. In the book, he doesn't say anything, but on the back of the train of his long red cape says, "Don't touch me, I am Red Death stalking abroad." And then in the Lon Chaney film, he says, "Beneath your dancing feet are the tombs of tortured men, and thus the Red Death rebukes your merriment." It's so iconic, the Red Death. It's so... I can't get over how much I love this story. It's a grand party, a masquerade, and then the knowledge of death creeping about the countryside, and how these people think they could just hide themselves in their castle, but yet the Red Death crashes the party. Yeah. So what are your thoughts about the Red Death? If you want to check out the short film that we made for the Saska's Women in Horror Month Blood Drive PSAs, inspired by Edgar Allan Poe's Masque of the Red Death, you can click here. Otherwise, would you guys like to hear me do another reading of maybe a Poe tale, an H.P. Lovecraft story, or maybe a reading from any other horror story? Just let me know. Sorry if I sound weird, just allergies. But this was fun. I did mess up here and there. Tim had his 2 cents here and there about the story too, but it was fun. Thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed this reading of The Masque of the Red Death. I hope you guys are having a wonderful day or evening. I miss you all, and be safe, stay healthy. Bye!